And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenters. Dr. Karen Karp is a professor in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. She is a recent recipient of NCTM's Lifetime Achievement Award and a member of the U.S. National Commission on Mathematics Instruction. Dr. Sarah Bush, a former middle school mathematics teacher, is currently a professor of K-12 STEM education at the University of Florida. She is a member of the NCTM Board of Directors and was the task force and writing team chair for catalyzing change in middle school mathematics. Dr. Barbara Dougherty is the Associate Director of Curriculum Research and Development Group and professor in the College of Education at the University of Hawaii, where she focuses on students who struggle in algebra in middle and high school grades. She is a former member of the NCTM Board of Directors. And Dr. Hilary Kreisberg is the director of the Center for Mathematics Achievement at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, an associate professor of mathematics education, and co-author on several curricular resources and books for educators and parents. She began her career as an elementary teacher and later became a K-5 math coach to be able to support other teachers in their understanding and teaching of mathematics. Now let's get started, and I will turn this over to Karen Karp.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming this evening. We're glad to see you. What we're going to do is start by asking you, how are you working at your workplace? Are you working as a group? That's a bunch of colleagues who show up every day and do your own thing? Or are you working as a team, a group that kind of reviews gameplays and aligns your work as a collective? We're going to be talking about making teams today and exactly how to get there if you're a group. So what we're saying is we'd like you to consider putting together what we're calling a mathematics whole school agreement. This is where we are deciding collectively that we're preparing students not just for our grade, but for the 30-year-old who's going to be living in the same community where we work. We want them to have the mathematical knowledge and the processes they need to be successful, because we'll all be successful if that happens. We really want to focus on engaging kids in doing math and building the long-lasting understanding that's important and can only be generated by that kind of activity. So this requires that we decide on a group of things that we'll be talking about through this presentation that will help us work as this team. Let's look at the next slide. So what we want is something that's shared by all stakeholders. And this is going to be collectively the way we're going to help students make sense of the content. We can align to standards this way best and figured out how we can each take a part of the puzzle. The Math Whole School Agreement aligns to NCTM's Catalyzing Change series by focusing on getting each student access to mathematically sound and high quality learning experiences. So who's in on all of this? Well, basically everyone. Obviously teachers of math, but principals, coaches, gen ed teachers, special ed teachers, of course, paraprofessionals, teaching assistants, long-term subs, interventionists, STEM lab, student teachers, observers for universities, and as Hilary's going to tell us, families. Take it away, Hilary.
Thanks, Karen. Families are critical partners in education, and especially in mathematics, if we want to see students thrive. And the reality today is that children have often been positioned inadvertently as the primary source of information regarding the shift in math education for their families. And so this only exacerbated as a result of COVID. Let's quickly step into parents' shoes before COVID-19 hit so that we can really understand how parents were feeling about math before a whole nother dynamic came about. When my co-author and I published our first book, Adding Parents to the Equation, which was written for parents, we first surveyed over 200 parents from across the states to understand how they were feeling about today's math instruction. And after coding the survey responses, we found that there were the top 4 words that parents used to describe describe their feelings about today's math were what you see on the screen here: intimidated, frustrated, worried, and confused. And these are really powerful words that inform us as educators that we have work to do when it comes to helping parents shift their feelings about today's math instruction to more positive emotions. So their rationales also give us information, right? So look at their explanations here on the screen, and specifically the bolded words. They say they feel intimidated because learning math in a totally different way means they don't believe that they can be helpful, or they're frustrated because they feel unintelligent and incompetent when unable to do third grade math homework. So we noticed that while parents commonly felt these emotions, it was less about their kids and more about themselves. And we'll take a look at that in a second. So what parents were really saying were things like, I'm intimidated because I can't help my own child. Sarah, you want to click? Yeah, awesome. Which we really think means that they just want to be able to help their kid, right? That's what they're really saying. Or they're saying things like, I'm frustrated because I feel like my intelligence is under attack, which led us to think that they were really just saying, I want to feel intelligent, and especially in front of my own child. Or they're saying things like, I'm worried that my child will fail math because of me, which shows that they just want to feel confident that their child will succeed, and they kind of feel responsible for that. And then last but not least, they say things like, I'm confused because I didn't learn math this way, and there are words, tools, strategies that I don't know, which is really them saying that they just want to be able to talk with their child about what they're learning and understand what they're saying. And so this led my co-author Matthew and I to develop what we call the 4 core wants of all parents, which is that they endeavor to support their child's math learning. And ultimately, they just want to feel helpful, intelligent, confident, familiar with the language. And so according to Henderson, Mapp, Johnson, and Davies, there are 4 essential core beliefs that all educators should hold, not specific to mathematics. And these are that all families have dreams for their children and want the best for them, that all families have the capacity to support their children's learning, that families and school staff are equal partners, and that the responsibility for cultivating and sustaining partnerships among school, home, and community rests primarily within the school staff, especially the school leaders. And so educators can use the 4 core wants of parents along with examining their own beliefs to ensure that they believe that all families they work with are capable of being partners to help support families.
The central components of this Math Whole School Agreement are the series that you see right in front of you here. And bit by bit, we're going to dig through the importance of language, notation, representations, rules, and generalizations on a path to making a robust mathematics whole school agreement. First, we're going to start with language. Language is the perfect springboard to get your agreement started. And what we're talking about here is using appropriate and mathematically sound language so that there's consistency across the school. We know that in math, sometimes words hold different meaning than they do in conversational language. And we want to make sure that students are learning those up front and that we make it clear that they have these different meanings. We surely don't want them to think that formula is something that we're giving a baby, or that when we ask them to create a table, we don't mean for something you're going to sit on, eat dinner at. So these are important pieces. How we introduce vocabulary matters, and we want to really focus on the fact that it is not like reading where you pre-teach a bunch of words. As a matter of fact, our dear friend Julie Dixon calls that that approach one of the 6 most unproductive approaches to teaching math. Bring up the vocabulary when you need it, when you're in the middle of it and students can see what those words actually mean in action. Avoid all mnemonics without any meaning. We'll talk about that in greater depth, but we need to get all, including families, including administrators, including the other teachers that are not always considered academic, art teachers, music teachers, phys ed teachers, speech language pathologists, everyone on board. We need a team. All right, so what do we want to do? We want to have, when you see an X here, it's a sign, don't do that. So we want to stop using what we call words that expire, such as reducing fractions, Let's face it, they're not getting smaller. They're not going on a diet. So we don't want to use that word. It's unproductive, even though it spills out of our mouth accidentally on occasion. We want to consider whether your curriculum says putting fractions in lowest terms or simplifying them. Agree, we're all using that language, and keep to it. Get rid of borrowing and carrying. They're basically meaningless terms that had to do with an algorithm that you and I were all taught when we were younger. That is not the approach we're using. We are not canceling fractions, variables, numbers. We don't want to say an equation and an expression are the same thing. They're not. And so we need to be precise what we're calling them. And graphs, not all graphs with bars are a bar graph. We have to call them what they are. Histograms, other things. Saying makes instead of equals. And what I mean by that, let's get rid of 2 plus 2 makes 4. No. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now let's look at something that also demands our consistency. And this is something where Beth Cobbett and our friends Delise Anderson and Beth Cobbett, they went into an elementary school and they visited classrooms where they saw a different poster for problem solving in every room. Notice that we made a big X on the keywords poster because, oh yeah, you never want to use the keyword strategy. It is not appropriate and not useful. So besides that though, let's go to the next slide to see what they decided was the real problem of having a different poster in every room. Check out what S means. So in first grade, if you have the cubes model, you learn that S means solve. But sorry. When you get to second grade, you have the super poster and S means slowly there. No, don't get too carried away with that, because in third grade, S means select a strategy. Fourth grade, switch it to solutions, and fifth grade, switch it to symbols. If you think kids who struggle are struggling for a reason, look at this table right here. There's no reason that you pick your problem-solving poster for what's free or what's cute. Make a decision across the building of what you're going to do each grade, and then you can build sophistication into it, but keep it so kids say, I've seen that before. Hilary, what do you say about this?
Yeah, well, you know what? That's interesting that you say that, because our language matters with families too. We often send home communication with words that have multiple meanings, like the word manipulative in math, which we as educators use on a daily basis, but manipulative to someone who's not in education has a very different definition. Or we use academic jargon like partial sums, expanded form. We use those like we talk about it all the time. And while we do as educators, parents and families do not. And so because of this, we encourage you to watch what we call edu-speak and try to write in parent speak or speak in parent speak instead, words that are more generally understood. And this also includes writing at a grade level that is most accessible. Did you know that approximately 36 million adults in America read, write, or do basic math at or below a third grade level? And so according to the most recent National Assessment of Adult Literacy, 52% of the United States adult population has a basic or below reading proficiency. And it's for these reasons that it's ever more important that our communication with parents is written in a way that can be received. And so given this data, it's recommended that the written resources are presented at no higher than an 8th grade reading level, with actually most recommendations saying about 6th grade reading level for general audiences. So math educators, you need to be deliberate about how we share our messages to ensure that that educational jargon that we speak is used as infrequently as possible, or it's accompanied by an explanation that's visual and written at a grade level that most families can access. And that another part of our language is also, when working with families, is to speak from a strengths-based perspective, which we talk about all the time with educators, but it also carries over at home. So what if we regularly were told that we don't do well, or what we don't do well? Now apply that question to a parent who grew up hearing negative feedback about their school progress or had negative experiences with school, in particular with math. What do you think the message is going to be if we communicate with that parent in a negative light about their child? Likely they're going to start to think that math is probably a gene and that their child is just not going to succeed at math because they didn't either. But if we as educators truly are about developing growth mindsets and reversing that once very popular notion that we inherit good or poor math skills, then we must communicate with parents in a way that empowers them to see what their child can do. And it also means communicating specifically what to do to help their child at home. So saying that the child's struggling with their math facts and then asking them to practice is just not specific enough anymore. Instead, tell them what facts their children do know, because they know something, and then specify the ones that they need some more work on, and then offer some sort of activity or game that's specific for the family to do together to practice.
Perfect. Now we're going to take a peek at notation. And because I want to just highlight that when we're reading an equation is what I mean with 2 + 2 makes 4. I'm saying when you're reading an equation, it should be 2 + 2 = 4. Read the word equal for the equal sign. So let's take a look here. The thing about notation is people think it's just so obvious, but it really isn't, because math is very precise. Unlike reading, where you could miss a word in a sentence or even miss a sentence in a paragraph and still get the gist of it, in math, every position, every dot, every comma is a meaningful piece. And if you look at here, some of the examples we're seeing is decoding the 5 and 53 or in 2/5 has extremely different meaning. If you look at the different values with the different units here, for the second one, again, similar numbers, but different meaning. And operations can be written in multiple ways, and we need to make it clear to students what those operation signs mean and how to use those to their advantage. One thing as we go forward is things not to do. We want you to use, wherever possible, the horizontal fraction bar vinculum. And it is because you can't tell what it means when it's diagonally like this. So is this 1/3 x or 1/3x? Well, nobody knows, okay? I just don't want to say that out loud, but it's true. So we also want people writing variables as not as italics, not just an x like the letter of the alphabet. All right, and that goes also for a multiplication sign. Pick the symbol off of the of Microsoft Word. Don't use an X, the letter. Writing only a number to represent a unit of measure, it's not 9, it's 9 square units. And to do otherwise is not communicating the notation you need. So to conclude with this notation section, we want to highlight one of the biggest items of interest, which is the equal sign. Many times we're finding that kids much later on have a misunderstanding of what the equal sign means. They often believe that it is a, here comes the answer, or give me the answer. And it is not that at all. Of course, it's a relational sign. They kind of believe it's an operation sign like addition, subtraction, something you do, but it's really falls in the category of greater than, less than, equal, or not equal to. And so this is the kind of thing and the kind of activities of building equations from a variety of different formats are all important components of making notation a key piece of this agreement. So let's move on and look now to Barb to talk to us about representations. Thanks, Barb.
Thank you, Karen. So representations are one of the ways in which we help to communicate mathematical ideas and be able to explain, but in some ways, they're one of the most confusing parts for students, because sometimes when they're working with physical materials or drawing pictures, they think they're just playing or they're just drawing, and they don't see the explicit link to mathematics. So let's think of ways of how we can enhance our use of utilizing representations to support stronger student learning. First, let's consider, why is it important to use multiple representations? So when we think about representing mathematics, we want to make sure that ways in which we present the mathematics allows opportunities for students to be able to identify relationships among quantities, relationships among different operations, even relationships among different topics that may not even seem related at all. But they have an opportunity to be able to compare and contrast different ways of seeing the same mathematical idea and finding one that makes sense for them so that they're able to reason with it and use it. One way that we often don't think about representations is the fact that representations can be used as a communication tool. And even though they're supporting that deeper understanding of mathematics, they provide a way in which students can demonstrate how they're seeing a mathematical idea, a concept or process in ways that words can't, and oftentimes will provide the words for the students in the same way. Next slide, please. So there are three representations that we typically think about when we think about representations. Concrete, the physical or hands-on, the semi-concrete, which is pictorial or graphical, and the abstract or symbolic. Now, what's interesting about this particular representation of the representation is you notice that they're all connected. And so one of the things that's very different as we're thinking about how to use representations in a math class is instead of presenting them as first concrete and doing that for several days, and then semi-concrete for several days, and then finally abstract, is teaching them all at the very same time so that students make connections across all three representations and see how they're related. Very important part so that we utilize the representations themselves to enhance the student learning. Next. If we take a look at ways of showing representations for elementary classrooms, we often think of some of these ways of representing, for example, word problems and the relationships found in word problems. The start, change, result schema is one way that we can represent the action that's taking place in a word problem. And you notice that the two that are at the top, one utilizing just counters and the other utilizing base 10 blocks, allow you to extend that across multiple grades. And that transitions into the part-part whole or a part-part model of some type that may involve both area and length. All of these representations make that relationship much more visible for students and allow us to be able to see how problems are interacting and look at the structure of the problem in ways that we can't do with only symbolic. We also have a similar way of looking at concrete, semi-concrete, and abstract representations when we move to middle and high school level. This is one of the pieces of the learning progression for developing how to solve an equation that we might use with algebra tiles that illustrates what Karen was talking about, the use of equal and showing how quantities are equal. But notice that as students are modeling this with the actual materials, they're also drawing this representation on their paper. And the most important part along with it, remember to keep all of those concurrent, is they're actually writing the mathematical action that's occurring underneath it when you see the equations that are being written to show the result of movement. Next. It's great to use representations, but we have to be sure that the representations are good ones. So there are typically three questions that we like to ask ourselves before we use a representation in a classroom. One is, does it accurately portray the mathematical idea? The answer to that is no. The other two questions are moot. Is it possible that students are going to be able to see the mathematical connection between whatever representation we're using and the mathematical idea? Very important. And third, is it the case that students can learn how to use the representation and it's not in an algorithmic form? If we have to teach students a step-by-step approach to use that particular representation, it's probably not the best one that we could use. So as you're working on your Math Pact, it's really important that you consider how you're going to think about representations and what you all can agree on. I think I'm going to pick just a couple of these to talk about specifically, but I think the first one is really important. We hear a lot of times where people say it just takes too much time to use a concrete material or to draw it out, but that actually, it's important to pay now so that you don't have to pay later and reteach. So bring them out and make those connections across the mathematics. I think the other one that I'd like to focus on is that it's really important for students to have time to explore that manipulative before you start to use it in the classroom. They need to explore it in a way that they understand that it's a mathematical tool and it's not a toy, it's not a play, It's really a tool that we can use to help us learn the mathematics and move that mathematics forward. So if we think about those considerations, then I think that we're going to create a stronger way for students to learn the mathematics. Now, Sarah's going to talk to us about rules.
Thank you, Barb. So our fourth component of a mathematics whole school agreement is the commitment as a team to stop using rules that expire. And what are rules that expire? Well, some of you may be familiar with them based on our past rules that expire articles that are in the NCTM, the legacy NCTM practitioner journals. But we're going to jump into that just a little bit in case you're not familiar with them. So we wanted to start by asking you, what did you learn as a student yourself? On the right-hand column, you'll see here some rules. Addition makes numbers bigger, multiplication makes numbers bigger. And when you multiply a number by 10, just put a 0 at the end of the number. So we're curious, and just think to yourself, were you taught any or all of these rules as a student? Or maybe you've taught them to your students as a teacher. Do you think these rules are always true? And if there's one or more of them you do not think is true, always true, can you think of a counterexample? So just think about that for just a second. All right, let's take a look at the first two, which was addition makes bigger and multiplication makes bigger. So, you know, one could think, especially with addition in maybe first and second grade, and with multiplication in third grade, that like these seem like pretty solid rules when we're adding whole numbers. Addition seems to make bigger. Again, we don't like that terminology makes at all. That's another troublesome thing about this rule. However, you can tell really quickly that these rules fall apart. And you might think, well, you know, they don't fall apart until students get in middle school when they start learning about integers and things like that. However, that's not correct. The rule actually fell apart the minute that you taught it, because a number plus 0 equals that number. It doesn't make a number that's any bigger. Also, you might consider fractions when you're working with multiplication, doesn't always make bigger. When you're working with decimals. And so anyways, the short version of this story is this rule never should have been taught in the first place, because it expired the moment it was taught. And by teaching it, it can cause problems for years down the road when students work with all different types of numbers. Multiplication one, of course, also falls apart the minute that you teach it as well. Let's look at the third rule. When you multiply it by 10, just put a 0 at the end of the number. Well, that might seem like a helpful thing to say. However, right away, when you're working with decimals, it falls apart. And so again, teaching it as a rule is very problematic. And you might be wondering, gosh, this doesn't happen that often, but we promise it does. In our book, you will see a massive table depending on what grade band you're in. It's focused towards the grade band of whichever book you're looking at. The table goes on and on and on and on and on. And how do we know these rules? It's because we taught them or we've heard others teach them, but we're the guilty ones. Karen probably taught them in elementary school. And then I was probably frustrated from the ones being taught in elementary, but then I was teaching the middle ones, and Barb was probably frustrated because she was teaching high school, but then she was teaching some of them too, and then students would go off to college and career. And so it's not a blame game. No one's at fault. These rules are probably taught with the best of intentions, because of course we only do things because we want to help students. But the important thing to know is, although well-intentioned, being well-intentioned doesn't mean it's actually helpful, and teaching rules that expire is not helpful. And we know some things about that we're going to share. And just to give you another example of how this happens in middle and high school, FOIL is another great example of things that fall apart very quickly, because students might learn FOIL for multiplying two binomials, but that gets really messy when students are working with a trinomial or some other sort of polynomial, and it all falls apart and they don't understand why they're doing that trick when all we really need to teach them is that they're using the distributive property multiple times, which reinforces conceptual understanding of the properties, which is exactly what we need to be doing. And for goodness sakes, foil is not a verb. You didn't foil it, okay? So you might be wondering, well, I'm just trying to help my students and they're going to grow out of these rules. And that seems like a logical thing to think, like students do grow up and they learn other things about life. But unfortunately, we have some evidence that actually shows that students do not grow out of the rules. They interpret rules as they want to interpret them, and they apply them in different ways, not necessarily as we want them to interpret and apply them. So Barb and her colleague conducted a study of Algebra 1 students, so these are like high school freshmen, across multiple states where they were given many different assessment items that were algebra related. And this one says, for example, Mari said 2t is always greater than t plus 2. Do you agree? And they were given 4 answer choices. Yes, because multiplication always gives you a larger answer than addition. Yes, because t is a positive number. No, because multiplication is not the inverse of addition. Or no, because it is possible that 2t can be equal to or less than t plus 2. So think just for a second how you think students may have responded. And again, these are high school students. They're probably 14, 15 years old. So just take about just a second to think about that. You might put in the chat if you want.
Oh, in the chat, yeah.
What you think, how most students would have answered, or what some popular responses might have been. Again, this is a multiple choice question. And then I'm going to drop a shocker on you. And that shocker is that almost 42% of students in this large scale study that Barb and her colleague conducted across multiple states, almost 42% selected A, which was a rule we can assume they learned in the 3rd grade 5 or 6 years earlier. They were holding on to a rule that expired, a well-intentioned, but unfortunately a problematic rule that expired that they learned probably 5 or 6 years earlier. And this is just one example. If Barb were to share more of the data with you, you would see that there were other problems that focused on other rules with similar outcomes. And so we promise you that students do not just grow out of the rules. And so it's much better that we just never teach them to begin with. So what do we know? And this is something that Karen always says. Telling isn't teaching. So just because you said it doesn't mean it was taught. Told isn't taught. And it's about developing mathematical ideas and doing math. We can't just assume just because we said something that students will remember it the way in which we want them to remember, or that they actually understand what they've been told, actually have conceptual understanding and or procedural fluency for what they've been told. Instead, we need to focus on the concepts and not teaching these rules that are unhelpful and expire.
Which leads
I'm going to turn it over to Hilary.
Yeah, which leads us to families, and they often come from the background that math is doing the math by telling, right? That's what they grew up with, that it's a set of rules or procedures. And so we must communicate with families about what specifically has adjusted and then give them the language to feel helpful, intelligent, confident, and familiar with the language. Remember those 4 core wants I talked about earlier. So for example, notice how on the screen here I have an example of correspondence you might send. This is a small excerpt of a longer correspondence you might send home. But notice how we include for parents a why are we learning it this way note, so that they can connect it to how they learned something, so that they can connect what their child's learning to how they learned it. They have some sort of relational understanding. So in this case, we show a connection between the partial sum strategy that a child's learning to the traditional addition algorithm that most parents are familiar with.
So now we're going to take the opposite approach when we are thinking about rules versus generalizations, and generalizations have such a very different meaning than rules do. Some people think they're the same, but this is where we get the conceptual understanding, and it's where students are able to develop those deeper ideas about the mathematics. So when we're thinking about generalizations versus rules, in generalizations, there are some key differences from rules. The key difference is, the big one, is that generalizations come from student experiences. These are not things that teachers just tell the students, but they're derived from the students' experiences where they notice patterns, they justify their thinking, they formalize it by drawing on all the different ways that we talked about with representations to create something that holds together across all cases. It's very, very different from rules because they last. They don't fall apart. They're consistent and they stay with students. They provide that glue for all of those connections that students make. Next. So while we may really want to develop generalizations, we also have to be aware that sometimes overgeneralizations occur, and they may occur from colliding with a rule that they were given. So for example, some students may say that their generalization is that the farther a number is away on a number line from 0, the greater the number. But we all know that that's not going to be true when they move to the left side of 0 and they're starting to work with negative numbers, because the further to the left they get, the smaller the number. So we have to be very careful and understand that even though generalizations are really important, the way that we state generalizations, the way that we provide the tasks that lead to generalizations, it's also possible that they can collide with rules and create some overgeneralizations. Next. But we can help students develop very strong generalizations by using a process task framework that we've included in the book. This is one that we developed at the University of Hawaii that involves taking regular traditional math tasks and adapting them to create 3 new kinds of tasks. And we're going to share some how that might look if we take just one problem and look at the 3 different ways in which we can adapt that task. So if we take the traditional elementary task of adding 3 add-ins like 13 plus 14 plus 15, 3 consecutive numbers, the issue with that particular task is once you solve it, you're kind of done. And only one student is maybe come up with the answer very quickly, and so the other students lose out on that opportunity. So let's change that a little bit so that we're able to get more bang for the buck out of a problem like that. So we're going to talk first about a reversibility task. In this reversibility task, students are asked to find 3 new add-ins whose sum is 42. Now that opens it up for them to be able to engage in the task at their level. They're able to come up with many, many different examples. There's an infinite number. And in fact, if students, the higher level students may even decide to use a rational number or a negative number, where students who may be struggling a little bit still have the ability to access that problem. A flexibility problem is one in which we help students to see relationships across problems. There's 2 types. In this particular one, we're asking them to decide what do they notice. So in the first problem, they're going to add the 3 add-ins, but notice what happens as they move to the second problem. In the second problem, if we're just looking at the add-ins, we notice that 2 of the add-ins were increased, and they can use that notion of the increase in the add-ins to determine the effect on the sum. Those kinds of relationships are not possible when we just give independent traditional problems, but it gives them the opportunity to see those relationships, and that leads to stronger ability to make generalizations. The third type of task is a generalization task. In a generalization task, they're posed a problem or a set of problems that leads to a bigger idea. And as we look at these 3 different types of problems that they're able to work with, those 3 problems start to create stronger number sense. They create more flexibility in working with number, and they give them the opportunity to do critical thinking outside of a traditional number task, but at the same time developing that notion of skill in a very different way that we can't get from a traditional task. So as you're working on your math whole school agreement, It's really important to commit to developing generalizations so that students have that opportunity to be able to develop their own flexibility in working with numerical, geometric, or whatever kind of thinking that they're working with, to be able to predict and make sense of the answers that they get and to determine if it even sounds reasonable. That development of more sophisticated ideas is really important and can hinge from using a reversibility, a flexibility, or a generalization problem, because they're able to ratchet their thinking from just the skill level to be able to think about it in a much deeper way. So now I think I'm turning it back over to Sarah.
Thanks, Barb. So you might be thinking, okay, I've heard about the 5 different components, and I've also thought quite a bit about families and the important role they play and how we can best partner with families. So what do I do now? How do I start to put this into action? And it might seem like a lot, but I think the thing to remember is this will happen over time. This is not a super quick, you don't run with your mathematics whole school agreement and get it all in place in a month. This is a long-term journey where you choose to pay now and you benefit much later for many, many years to come. So it's an ideal investment, and the winners of the investment every time will be your students, which will then also make you the winner, and all the partners the winner in the investment. So one thing that we like to say, that's Barb saying, one of our favorite things that came from writing the book, is to change your practice, you have to practice change. And we think a whole school agreement is a perfect example of that. And a whole school agreement, as Karen mentioned, is a team endeavor, not a individual or group endeavor. And what we mean by that is a mathematics whole school agreement really launches your school from maybe having these pockets of excellence in instruction and what students are getting out of their mathematics learning experience to an entire system of excellence, which again ensures that every student has the highest quality mathematics instruction and program. And that really helps align to the goals of the Catalyzing Change framework. So as you think about implementing, you have to think about some non-negotiables. And one non-negotiable, especially, this is a really great one for administrators and others working on the schedule to hear, one non-negotiable is teacher teams absolutely need non-negotiable planning time during the school day. To establish a mathematics whole school agreement and to think about how you're going to partner with parents and families, there has to be time to talk through things, reflect, discuss, and plan, because you have to get everyone on the same page as a team. Another important consideration is what resources you're going to use. They absolutely have to be appropriate and vetted. We don't recommend any one curriculum or anything like that, but we do recommend that everyone is on the same page and people are not going rogue on their own and selecting resources at random. You're instead using vetted resource-based materials that follow a coherent learning progression so that important concepts aren't skipped or missed or duplicated, which is not a good use of time either. So things to consider as you're trying to establish consistency across your grade level, your school, and eventually your district. What's going to be your timeline for implementing a mathematics whole school agreement? Maybe you start tomorrow with language because that is a low-hanging fruit and something easy to get started with. Maybe you immediately start making a list of rules that expire you're no longer going to use. But no matter where you start and what you do, you need a long-term timeline so everybody's on the same page about what you're going to do. You need to think about the format of things. How are lessons generally going to go? Do all lessons have 3 main components? Is there a unit map that's a certain, do you use templates for different things? Maybe it's some of the materials you send home to families. You just think about all those different things you might want to establish consistency for. What are the look-fors when someone walks into your classroom? whether it be an administrator or a colleague that's going to watch you model a lesson, like what should they be looking for? And it's no longer the traditional things that they're looking for, where it might be orderly students and desks and rows. Instead, they might be looking for messy, kind of a messy, chaotic situation, but where great math talk is happening. But sometimes people don't know what to look for unless you've made it really clear what everyone should be looking for. So that's a conversation to have. And even things like having clear expectations for homework across the board, K5, 6, 8, 9, 12, K12, wherever it is in your whole school agreement, but having clear expectations. So just like those keyword posters, students aren't learning, not keyword, problem solving posters, sorry, the keyword posters are a no, but the problem solving posters, you want consistency, so every year students aren't having to learn a new routine. Right, so Hilary?
And if all of that feels very intimidating, at least start by just choosing something to commit to. And that's a really good place to start. And so when you develop your whole school agreements, you want to think about each role. So if you're an administrator, maybe you're going to commit to communicating the school's expectation to teachers and staff and defining their roles and responsibilities, which often can be ambiguous. Or maybe you'll send school-wide communication to parents and guardians this year more than ever. Choosing one of these things. Pick one thing to commit to if you're an administrator. And if you're a teacher or an instructional leader or math coach, you also choose something to commit to. Maybe it's promoting growth mindset and redirecting negative or fixed mindset talk within teachers, not just within our students. Maybe it's you're going to commit to sending home one letter at the beginning of the year that comes from you to parents and families about the shifts in math education today. And then parents and guardians. What are you going to do for parents and making sure that they are committed to something? Because it includes families too. They're part of this whole school agreement. So maybe you ask families to commit to reading the information that's sent home, or maybe you ask families to commit to allowing their child to submit incomplete homework if they struggle, which I often struggled with as a teacher, getting families to recognize that that was okay. Maybe you get families to commit to speaking positively about math in front of their children. Ask them to commit to something because all of us are a team together. Sarah, did you want to talk more about some instructional do's and don'ts?
Thank you. And I kind of mentioned earlier, and this goes with what Hilary said as well. We have a template in our resources that focuses on anticipated barriers you might face to establishing a mathematics whole school agreement, and then kind of a team discussion on what you're going to do to overcome that barrier. Barriers aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's what makes the work meaningful because you're coming up with important solutions. So we do have a helpful template for that. And another resource we have is some instructional don'ts and do's that we think make really good commitments for your whole mathematics whole school agreement team. And just to name a couple examples, one commitment might be the understanding and the agreement that don't think that if you taught it, it was learned, and an agreement to instead focus on evidence of student learning. And we don't mean just, high stakes assessment here. We mean meaningful formative assessment, discussion with students, discourse, all of those sorts of things. Another commitment is the commitment to stop using disconnected mini lessons, which we know are pretty popular in other subject areas, but that in mathematics, there's so much deep understanding that has to be built. We really need to stop doing that and instead focus on a deep sequence of coherent lessons, which again talks, about that not going rogue and picking out your own lessons at random. And then finally, kind of a commitment to stop with the I do, we do, you do model. Which again is not effective for math, and instead flip that script to a you do, you all do, we do together, where at the end the teacher might reinforce some of those key ideas. All right, Karen? I think you're muted still.
I know, I'm trying to get my unmute here. So let's think about what might be a first step. Well, how about getting together with your grade level, or if you're in high school, your course, and start there. get some cohesion around what you're doing at your grade. Then move up and down vertically within your school to the next courses or the courses that come before, so that you can be communicating with each other as to, I need you to be doing stuff with a number line if I, in third grade, have to have kids position fractions on a number line. It can't be the first time they've seen it. Then we have to move vertically across the district. Branch out to all the stakeholders in the school. And again, this means the other teachers, even if they don't think they're teaching math, they may be needing the language that we're using. We have considerations both at the pre-K, get any daycare, preschools in your area that are feeding into your kindergarten, bring them in. Have a night where you're having information for them as to what they could be doing and what language you would wish for if you could have it in your school. They're willing to help. They just need to have the kind of information of, how can I be on the team? Same for post-secondary. What are the community colleges or local schools wanting from the high schools that we can coordinate? So this is just a piece of the puzzle, but Hilary, tell us what can families do?
So as you consider families, specifically think about how you can view them as partners. They want to help their children and be part of the solution, but they usually just don't know how. They need school leaders and teachers to partner with them to provide that explicit information about what role they should be playing. Also, communicate often. In order for parents to best help and support their children, they need to know how and when to intervene. So communicate with them often about their children's mathematics progress, and offer specific suggestions, like we said earlier, that they can immediately put into place. Use parent speak, so avoid that educational lingo and abbreviations, and be sure that your communication is written in an easy readable manner at a 6th grade level or below. And use strengths-based language. Remember, speaking from that positive place, and of course, include them in your mathematics whole school agreement.
So we're back to the starting point. We hope that you can see that moving forward as a team might require some work, but it is well worth the energy. We know that if we have a 1st grade teacher teaching the flip-flop property, which is really the commutative property, by the time they get to 3rd grade, they say, I think that's a flip-flop property, and the teachers don't even know what they're talking about. What initially takes time saves time. If the student's brain isn't cluttered with stuff that they have to unlearn, and that really is not a good use of anyone's time. Just because something you thought might be the thing that would be some trick or some quick kind of gimmick. That's not what we need. We need an agreed upon set of things that we're doing as a team. So we hope you're on board. We're kind of counting on it. So thank you so much.